I am here with Jim Newman. Jim, thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation because you are perhaps the most relentlessly non-dual person I've come across in quite some time in the way you talk about these things, which is fun and very much to my taste from a contemplative point of view. But before we plunge into the paradox, I just want to get some sense of how you got here. I mean, how do you describe your path to having a view on any of the topics we're about to touch? Where did you start, and who were your primary teachers? And so I just want a kind of potted spiritual biography on Jim Newman.
Yeah, I generally refrain from any of that because one of the most difficult things when talking about this is you're talking often to an experience that what's happening is a process.
Mm.
The message is that's illusory. So, I mean, we can talk about the apparent history of Jim, but it then makes it seem like what we're talking about is a result of that.
Yeah, no, I think we can differentiate the logic there really at every point because I think what we'll be talking about the misunderstandings people have and the needless suffering born of those misunderstandings. But
Mm.
it would be interesting to know what false starts, if any, you made, and just in terms of your own timeline, how you view the process by which you became familiar with the things we'll talk about.
Yeah. Okay. So again, I have to say that it had nothing to do with being familiar with anything, but there was, I guess you would call it a sort of an uninitiated awakening with a man called Barry Long. It happened at one of his meetings or soon afterwards. It's hard to pinpoint when these things actually happen,
Mm.
but there was sort of just the recognition. Well, it actually was completely indescribable. But when that initial realization or happening passed, not knowing what it was, I then fell into trying to follow his teaching in order to regain what I thought had happened.
Hmm.
And that went on for about 15 years, quite frenetic, actually.
Mm. Was he teaching specific approaches to meditation, or was he? I'm not familiar with Barry Long. Is he part of some traditions?
It's a whole, he considered what he was talking about a whole teaching. It had a very core aspect of the love between man and woman. But for me, it all related back to that realization, or whatever you want to call it, when I met him initially and the effort to find that. Now, that first realization, it was obvious it had nothing to do with him. But when it went away, just the doubt poured in of what had happened.
Mm.
There was it was completely unexpected, everything that was revealed in that. And so, although part of it was the realization or the recognition had nothing to do with him, when it left, I thought maybe that was also something I was just ignorant about. And so, choicelessly, I just had to follow what he was saying because it seemed to have had something to do with him initially.
Mm.
And that went on for about 15 years.
Yeah,
And
as it can.
yeah. And it was at a point where it just obviously wasn't going to work that I started to look at other things, and I came across a man named Tony Parsons, and immediately recognized that what he was talking about was what had happened so many years ago.
Mm.
And choicelessly, because this isn't a message that anyone ever, it doesn't seem to me anybody ever really chooses this, because it goes against most expectations and needs of that separate experience. But choicelessly, it just was recognized that that's what it was. And so in a way, that was the end of it.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Tony. I've never met him, but I've seen some videos of his. So, at any point were you formally practicing meditation, or sitting Buddhist meditation retreats or anything like that?
I did do some of that, but Barry Long was very much meditation. Meditation was a large part of his. It's a process of detachment. I find most teachings, it was a teaching. Teachings are always have to do with knowing something. And so the teaching of his was a process of knowing, detaching, finding the I am that is unmoving. The state of detachment was what that was about. And, you can find that and hold that for periods of time, but that was the practice.
Hmm. And were psychedelics ever part of your seeking to
It
break
did
through to
not
this? Or
really a part of it, not really as part of the seeking. I had an experience in college, and basically what it showed me was that normal perception was not all there was.
hmm Yeah, and can be quite useful for that, particularly if you're someone who thinks normal perception is really the only possibility.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So my interest here is in trying to really drill down on the paradox here, the mystery here, and make it as unparadoxical as possible.
Mm,
There are ways in which that isn't possible unless someone really has the insight we're talking about. But I'm convinced we can do a better job than most here to really indicate the shape of this, even if someone hasn't glimpsed it. And, in the best case, to actually help people glimpse this.
mm,
And I guess the place to start is let's try to connect where most people, in fact, will be starting. I mean, most people who are listening to this conversation will feel that they're listening for a reason, right? There's something they want to get out of this.
mm,
They're motivated by a feeling of dilemma,
mm,
which, as we know, probably permeates every aspect of their lives, but in particular, it becomes the motive force for spiritual seeking, for becoming interested in a practice like meditation, for meditating regularly. Meditation becomes part of the apparatus by which they're seeking to change experience. And no matter how much you
mm,
admonish them that that's really not the logic by which it works, there's this subtle, corruption of the process that is probably inevitable in everyone's case. It's just the question is, how long does this last? Where you're trying not to do anything, you're trying to merely accept and recognize experience as it is, but actually the emotional and existential subtext of all of this is you're not satisfied with your experience on some level, and meditation is another tool you've adopted to try to improve it. Maybe we can just begin by you speaking to that starting point and what you think has to happen to give someone a fresh pair of ears to hear what we're going to be talking about.
I don't think anyone would want to hear this. I don't think there's a possibility that that separate experience could choose to want to hear what's being said. It really is, for me, as far as I can tell, I'm sure there are exceptions, a choiceless hearing. And it has nothing to do with any sort of process or any sort of happening. It's quite obvious. See, the difficulty we had at the beginning with me giving a process-oriented who did I go to and what did I do, it makes it sound like that prepared the ground for this. And it doesn't.
So to put this in a Buddhist framing, even as you know, I'm sure there are non-dual teachings within Buddhism, and then there are teachings that seem to have been given without any awareness that non-duality was on the menu.
Yeah.
But if you, even in a non-dual context, something like Dzogchen, there's an acknowledgement that there's a requisite amount of concentration and mindfulness someone needs just to even pay attention enough to follow your train of thought, to even listen to this conversation successfully and have anything you might say resonate. The person can't be distracted every moment of the hour and just thinking about lunch, right? So there's some orienting precursor which some people can get through training attention, explicitly in a practice like meditation. Some people might get it some other way. Some people might not need it. They might be born with it. But there is just this phenomenon of many people seek this thing explicitly and have the experience you're describing, which is they did something that was designed to produce some kind of spiritual breakthrough. It didn't really work as advertised. In retrospectively, it's not absolutely clear if any part of it was actually useful. And in fact, it may have been. I mean, you can't really run the counterfactual to know, whether you would have been available to this subsequent insight if you hadn't done any of those things. Although,
But you can, because it's obvious that this conversation, or what is apparently happening now, isn't the result of anything else. As long as this is a result of anything else, it's a part of a process. And that the only way you can have a process and results is if there's a positional center that knows what's happening. And what we're talking about is that positional center is actually illusory. So the illusory center can't practice to find the illusory nature of itself. All practice comes out of the experience that the illusory nature, the illusory experience, is real and needs to be overcome. The experience is that there's real separation that needs to be overcome. That's an illusion. There is no separation. There just simply isn't. But that's already the case. So practice is merely knowing. It's merely an exercise in knowing. And the experience of separation is the experience of knowing, which engenders the need to know. And spirituality and practices and teachings are all about the experience of the individual. Is if I knew enough, if I worked it out well enough, then I would finally have what I'm looking for or feel is missing. The suggestion is the sense of something missing is illusory. There is no way for knowing to ever be satisfied because it engenders in itself the need to know. So there is no preparation for what, I guess what's completely illogical about this message is what we're talking about is what's happening. Not as a result of anything else, but as the Big Bang, the causelessness, the Alpha and the Omega, which is this already and can't possibly be found. Nor could it be lost. So what's being shared isn't coming from a position of revelation or recognition or knowing.
One of the problems here is that we obviously have to use words and concepts to get this across. And I think perhaps in your teaching, certain words have either become, in any teaching, frankly, certain words become either part of the jargon, part of the lexicon, or stigmatized as being misleading. And it's, whether a word like recognition or knowing or insight or wisdom or emptiness or consciousness, you may not like the sound of many of those words, but yet someone else might find them indispensable to try to indicate the same thing. And so on some level, there's just some semantic work to get through to figure out how to talk about this. But I mean, for instance, I completely follow what you're saying. I'd have slightly different associations with some of these terms. So when you say something like you can't recognize this thing,
it's not, but you can't.
But you can cease to overlook it. I mean, we're talking about something that when recognized, to use now a loaded term, part of that recognition is that this is always the case, right? It's not constructed by the act of recognition. It's not produced by it. This isn't a change in yourself that you have made because now you're paying attention in a new way. This is the way, here I'm going to use another reckless term, this is the way consciousness is already.
Yeah.
You're not producing this. But it sounds like you're not a fan of those particular words. So perhaps you should just get rolling a little bit and describe how you describe this so that I can adopt your terminology.
Right. I don't actually think it's a pedantic issue. I think it's just the suggestion is so illogical, which is why I don't think anybody ever really chooses this, because it doesn't conform to the expectations or needs of the seeking energy. It's completely inconceivable that there is no separation, that there isn't something that happened that made this where this suggestion comes from real. It's the best I do is I can say things like it's an unhappening. So the experience of being an individual unhappens because it never really happens. There's never really separation. It's an illusory experience of separation. So that unhappens. Consciousness unhappens as far as somebody knowing what this is, in that it's recognized or revealed that consciousness is a contracted energy of knowing, of separation. I am conscious of, or I know something, or there's awareness going on. And the suggestion isn't that there's some, the expectation of the individual is that something needs to be added. And what we're suggesting is that that's an illusory experience, and that the end of that isn't an addition to things. And there isn't someone, so Jim doesn't walk around with the non-dual awareness or non-dual consciousness. There's just a seeming lack of solidity to the appearance. It just doesn't, there's a need of the individual to find something, a need to know that it is. And that seems to create an experience of solidity in the appearance. But when that stops happening, that isn't something new revealed. It's the end of something that wasn't happening already. Was that enough for you to get a little bit of the jargon?
Yeah. So I'm sure this is a high wire act that I'm going to fail at various points because,
No.
but yeah, I track all of that. Again, I have some words that I like to use that mean some of those same things, but let's see how we proceed. Because again, there are things you said even there which almost by your own logic you shouldn't be able to say if we're really going to
Totally.
strip words or push words to the breaking point here.
Yeah.
So it's something like contracted energy, like describing this pseudo position from which everyone seems to start, and the undoing of which, or the apparent undoing of which, is the resolution of this non-process. How do you describe this self-illusion? I mean, where are people apparently stuck? Because contracted energy is one interesting way of describing what this is like.
Well, it's revealed in how it falls apart. And this is just a story. It has no helpful quality to it all to know this. But when it falls apart, what's revealed is there's a contracted energy in the body. And the first thing that arises out of that is a sense of here. Here is then the first thing that seems to be known, and it feels very secure in a way, comforting. There's something real. And out of that here-ness comes an experiential center, an illusory experiential center of I am here. From that arises the entire story that this appearance is connected in a real way, and that's called my life. And part of that need that arises when I have a life is one of meaning and purpose and the need to know. And that is basically my life of trying to find a better experience through knowing or having experiences, or however you want to talk about it. And that whole description is an illusion. There never is a real separate entity that needs to know. Nor is there a real separate entity that can know in that way. Of course, Jim knows where his house is, but there's no need of knowing that center experience in relation to that information that arises of where the house is.
So then what is different in your experience in mundane moments like knowing where your house is? Right. So obviously you're capable of thinking, you're capable of having a conversation like this. So thought doesn't stop.
No.
Or need not stop.
It's obvious that nobody's having it, the thought, though.
Right.
For the individual, when whatever arises, it's like a cloud of knowing. There actually never is something inside the body, although that's the experience. There's a cloud of knowing that arises, which imbues everything that seems to appear inside and outside the body. And that's all me. That's all me in my world. It takes ownership. So it takes ownership of thoughts. It takes ownership of feelings. It takes ownership in the things that it belongs to it or doesn't. Everything is in its purview and belongs to it as an experience. And that just disappears like a cloud, like a fog lifting. And so a thought arises, but nobody has it.
How does this relate to suffering?
Depends on what you call suffering.
Yeah.
If
So
we
what?
call it
What?
seeking,
Well, yeah, so yeah, you feel free to push in that direction. What is obviously many people approach this topic as a project of reducing suffering, understanding something about the mechanics of suffering such that one no longer suffers in the same ways and perhaps ultimately doesn't suffer at all, depending on what one means by suffering there.
hmm,
You initially said that it's impossible to want this thing because it doesn't answer to any of the spiritual needs people think they have, but doesn't no longer being taken in by the self-illusion answer to this problem or apparent problem of suffering?
it depends what you call suffering. I mean, in one way, you can say that if you call suffering seeking or the need, then yeah, that would be the end of that. But of course, the conundrum then is if the individual is seeking the end of the need, seeking that is just another need. This message truly isn't for anyone because it really doesn't mirror any of the needs of the individual as far as needing to know more. The suggestion is that this conversation is unknowing or emptiness appearing as a conversation. And that's the beginning and the end of the whole thing. And that satisfies none of the questions, none of the needs of the individual.
Well, although there's potentially a lot riding on that moment when you cease to suffer the search, right? The search can be quite painful,
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
and there's tremendous relief in no longer being taken in by its logic.
Yeah.
So there's a freedom here, obviously. I mean, there's a freedom from the illusion of self, and that has consequences. What are its consequences?
There's it's I find it a little tricky to talk about it because what we're talking about isn't something that anybody really gets. So I, if I can use that word, don't know about anything I'm about to tell you because it's not an experience. But there seems to be like the individual is constantly wanting to know. It's trying to control its circumstances. It feels very threatened by what's happening. It's trying to control its circumstances through knowing, through controlling, through making its choices, its imaginary choices of what it thinks it's going to bring about what it feels it's missing. And so that need to know filters through the memories quite a lot, has a lot of interactions with emotions as far as what's okay to feel, what's not okay to feel. It can make itself quite neurotic. And so in that way, that whole system, the mental and emotional system, can relax, become calmer, because there's nobody, quite literally, nobody left that's engaged in trying to find anything else, trying to find a better experience. There's simply what's arising. And so there's no longer the need to pick up every appearance and orient itself to it as far as trying to find a path from here, which is dissatisfying, in fundamentally dissatisfying, to another experience, which will be better. So in that way, you could say that that emotional and mental suffering, which I think for the individual are the biggest things, does soften up. But it would be misleading to say that there's not uncomfortable thoughts or uncomfortable feelings that arise. There's just no longer anyone left engaging them. They just arise and they just go away again. But I couldn't say that the end of suffering, there was an experience I had a long time ago where it was realized that you could starve to death and that wouldn't be a problem. And there was no emotions that would touch me as a form of detachment. And I find that that gets mixed up with what I'm talking about now. That's not what this message is now. That's a form of detachment, which I think a lot of teachings are aiming towards as far as a state of detachment.
Mm.
This message is truly that there's no center experience to the appearance. There's just what's appearing, and thereby there's no need coming from a personal position for it to become something else.
Just so I understand what you the contrast you just made, are you saying that there are traditional teachings that give a kind of false goal of detachment, like complete imperviousness to ordinary suffering, which you're
Totally.
okay?
Well, there are states
Yeah,
which I happen to have realized or experienced. It's
right.
actually not an experience, but where that's and I think pretty much that's what the first teacher I was involved with was teaching. And I do think, I mean, although I think it answers totally the quest of the individual, that would be what it wants most, to be able to be in that detached state and be unaffected by the thoughts and feelings, which seems to be its biggest issue. That's not what this message is.
So what then is the status of an emotion like anger or sadness in this condition? Post self-illusion, is there any logic by which an emotion like anger would arise?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, any emotion can arise, it seems. It's just when there's an individual, it arises within a context of good and bad and right and wrong, and the path that I seem to be on called my life of trying to find a better experience, or they're just being the emotion. That's the difference.
But to not be taken in by the illusion of separateness, right? And to
But
not
there
be
isn't anybody that's not taken in.
right, but there's, conventionally speaking, there's still the person, Jim, in the world who is now
But there isn't really. We're not talking about a separate experience of spirituality in one reality, and then Jim just moves back into this other reality. There, we're quite literally talking about that this, let's say, this conversation or whatever seems to be arising is the whole of everything. There isn't anything outside of it. There's only this instantaneous isness, which can't even be objectified. So you can't actually say it is. You'd have to say it is and isn't. And that doesn't have a real continuum in which it functions or acts. Now, we can talk about the function of the brain and what that does, but then we're getting into a story trying to explain something, and you really can't explain this instantaneousness that's just appearing now for absolutely no reason.
yeah. So I think I frame this a little differently. I think I'm acknowledging the same set of facts, but I think there's some facts left out, or some, apparent facts left out by one of these frames. I think we can talk about this at the level of experience, where I would use terms like consciousness and its contents and, and the mind, right? And then there's certainly reason to believe that the experiential component of this conversation doesn't subsume all of reality, whatever that is altogether, right? Like you and I could both suffer heart attacks in the middle of this conversation, and, the city of Paris would be unaffected. At the very least, that sentence will make sense to virtually everyone, right?
Yes. And this message doesn't.
Well, no, but I think it can. Perhaps I'm more hopeful than you that we can really bring it right up to the.
But it seems like you're actually trying to talk to somebody about it. And I keep trying to reference the fact that there isn't anybody to tell. When there isn't anybody left in the body, it's recognized that there isn't anyone anywhere.
Yeah.
There isn't anyone to help. The only time that there's someone else is when a body goes, there's somebody here.
Yeah, help.
Otherwise,
help.
there isn't.
Yeah, no, I get that. So
Okay.
Here are two places where I would differentiate these two frames of reference: the kind of the experience side, the knowing side, the epistemology side, and the reality at large side. Talking about the cosmos, say, or the what is here when neither one of us are aware of anything anymore. So, obviously there are many things we understand about the world, or seem to understand about the world. We can make predictions about the future. We can manipulate the material world, whatever its relationship is ultimately to the mind, and produce certain effects that are obviously amazing, right? We've got a virus burning through 200 countries right now, and we're busily producing vaccines to stop that problem. And that there's a level at which knowledge claims and causality and all of that is working more or less as described, and the difference between knowledge and ignorance there really has obvious consequences within that purview. There's a
Mm.
difference between having a vaccine for coronavirus that works and and one that doesn't work, but you thought would work. So those are different states of the world, and they will matter to many people who think they are individuals, living life projects that, wherein death is really a problem. So there's that level of the conversation where we can talk about things like vaccines and viruses and, ordinary objects. But then there's the experiential side, which we're focusing on now, where we're drilling down on just what is the nature of consciousness? What's the nature of being in the world in this moment? And what can we really say about that? And what is available to experience or to cease experiencing that is of interest here? And, there you can notice things like, though, yes, we can talk about viruses and mRNA as a mechanism by which you'd produce some novel vaccine, right? But the truth is, when you really pay attention, you realize you don't know what anything is.
Yeah.
You can't know anything. You look at your own hand, you don't even know what a hand is, right? It's like
Mm.
there is just this bright circumstance that is intrinsically mysterious, right? So I think we can do justice to both sides of that without falsifying either.
Yeah, absolutely. And but I'll have to say this everything you've described, the way you describe it, it sounds like there's two different realities. The one of the world where all these aspects or contingencies are apparently happening, and then the what you mentioned as the experiential, focusing down, drilling down on now and the unknowingness of that. And what I'm, not me, but what the message is about is that both of those things are simply what is.
Hmm.
And that what is emptiness appearing. And what seems to happen when there's no longer an individual interested or with that intrinsic need for the appearance to be one way or another, yeah, you can totally talk about there being a wonderful thing that a vaccine is the RNA and the new vaccine that's coming out, and that people won't die, and that can be seen as a positive thing. And at the same time, that entire thought is emptiness appearing. It really, in essence, has no value and is not separate from what is. The dream of the individual is that there's what's happening to me, and that necessarily creates or has within it the need for something else, because what is, as known, is dissatisfying. And so it lives in these two realities. And when that experience falls away, and we're actually talking about the end of experience, then there is obviously only what is. And that is then, I can't say seen, but it's no longer experienced as real. It's never experienced as unreal, but there's no longer this extra added on experience of real and therefore mattering and therefore having value. And what's left without that, and these things aren't true, they're only true in reflection of the end of that experience, is that what is then recognized or seen or revealed to be unconditional love and unrecognizable freedom. So it's not sort of some denatured zombie experience, but it's the recognition that this doesn't actually need anything already.
Are there fluctuations in your awareness of this, or would you say that this is a stable?
I'm not aware of it. This isn't an awareness.
Well, again, I realize I'm walking through the minefield of.
It's not a minefield. It's that you're actually coming. I don't know that you quite understand what I'm saying. The radical nature of the message, that I'm truly saying that what is arising is unknowing. And that only seems to change in the illusory experience of the individual, where there is unknowing, which is appearing, and then another imaginary reality called something else. Because everything you've described so far is still what is.
Yeah,
It
no,
never moves.
I get that. And so, but again, there are terms that are apparently sanctioned in your vocabulary, and there are terms that hit a tripwire, right? So knowing detonates, but something like emptiness, I can get across the minefield and with emptiness in hand, right? So,
I don't think that's fair.
well, I'm comfortable with both terms. I just don't necessarily know. I'm not familiar enough with your teaching to know when I'm going to step on a landmine. So I just have to step on them. But so here's an experience that I believe I've had, and I believe many other people have had. I mean, it's certainly well attested to in the literature on these things. And it's an experience that the Advaita people tend to not acknowledge. Now, this is not true of all of them, but some of them. So, did you ever meet Punjaji in India?
Yeah, I spent a year there.
Oh,
Yeah.
you did? Oh, interesting. So what year?
91, around Christmas. So it was either 90-91 or 91-92.
So this is before he had been discovered by the Rajneeshis, and it had a much smaller scene there. I mean, there would have only been a few people in that early, right?
No, this was after that. This was after Osho had died. There were quite a few people there.
Oh,
it was getting bigger.
Oh, but that had to be later than 91, I think.
No, I'm pretty, well, it might have been. I'm pretty certain it was 91. But
anyway. Interesting. Okay, so yeah, I was there before all of that, although I thought it was, if I had to have guessed, I would have put it around 91. But, so before he was discovered by Osho's people.
Yeah.
So anyway, so Punjaji, as you know, was also fairly uncompromising in the way he would talk about this. I mean, he wouldn't, unlike someone like his teacher, Ramana Maharshi, he wouldn't make any concessions to practice or to gradualism or to effort. And the explicit message was either you understand what I'm talking about or it's hopeless, right? There's nothing you're going to go do on your own to make any progress, right? So just, understand what I'm saying right now, or there's no path. And if you do understand what I'm saying, there's still no path, right? There's nothing for you to do with this understanding, right? You're not going to practice the implications of this conversation right now. If you understand, you're done. And if you think you need to practice anything on the basis of what I just said, you didn't understand what I just said, right? So it's like the steepest possible path. So there are two reasons why I think he was wrong about that. And the first is that it was obvious what the consequences of that style of teaching were among many people. People would, seem to see the light in the midst of, having that conversation with him. Somebody would jump up and say, "I get it." I see it. And it was pretty clear from spending some time with those people afterwards that, in the aftermath of their full enlightenment, they were not going to be the next Buddha of the age, right? I mean, these people were still neurotic and confused in various ways, and now they had been delivered a message that spiritual practice was completely pointless, and they accepted that, but then they went back to their lives and began, seeking happiness in all the usual ways, and they just no longer had a spiritual option. The path had been taken away from them, and then they're left with 12-step programs and going to Burning Man and what anything else they were doing, And so there was that problem. But there was also the problem that many of us had this more intermediate experience, which is we recognized the non-duality that was being described, but the recognition was unstable. You recognize it, but then you could overlook it again. So essentially your mindfulness became non-dual, but you weren't made perfectly mindful for the rest of your life by virtue of having had this insight.
Yeah.
There still seemed to be something to practice, in the sense that there still was this oscillation between being distracted by thought and clearly recognizing what is prior to thought. It's not nullified by the arising of thought, but there's still an apparent difference between recognizing and not recognizing. And Punjaji didn't seem to be conceding that. He's basically said, if you recognize for 1 second, you'll be stable for the rest of your life. And that just seemed to be disconfirmed by the experience of many, many people. So I put that to you as what I perceive to be the liability of this way of talking about it.
Yeah. It is very radical. I'll have to say, with the way you describe it, it sounds like what I was talking about is an experience that I had, or non-experience, of the I am prior to thought, which seems to be sort of what Punjaji was talking about, which is why he would say, don't take a thought. Or he did suggest, when I was there, he was suggesting, who am I? As I can't remember if he actually said it or if it was just in the crowd who said it. But there seemed to be some suggestion that there was a state that one could be in. And I'm really talking about something radically different.
You don't think Punjaji was also talking about emptiness and non-duality in the sense that you're referencing those things?
It doesn't seem so. It doesn't seem so because he was still talking to someone, suggesting that they do certain things, such as don't take a thought. I can't remember anything he said, quite honestly, but I do remember feeling like there was something that needed to be done. I did not get the radical nature that there wasn't anywhere else. And that experience of something else has to do with an illusory experience of a solidity as a center to the appearance. And I find that his tradition and the people that came after him and the one before him were really talking about something different. Now, if they meant the same thing, I don't know. But the way they talk about it, they make concessions to individuals, and this makes no concessions.
So maybe I got him in a very Jim Newman mood, because to my ear he was saying the same thing.
Okay.
But I could see that he could be pushed in the direction of making concessions to something that seemed like a practice or...
Yeah. I'm not that well versed on him. I mean, even though I was there for a year, I sat in front of him a couple of times, asked a few questions, and there were always some sort of suggestions of something needed to happen.
It could have been what the Osho people did to him when they got there with all of their tantric energy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So perhaps you can help me with my apparent dilemma here. So my perception of myself is that I can experience, again, to use a loaded term for which I don't have
It's not loaded in that sense. It's that it points to separation. For experience, there's a subject and an object.
No, and so what I'm about to say is that, experience non-duality, experience emptiness, experience no separation, whatever, however you want to. I'm not sure which verb you like.
I would never, but I just don't see it as an experience. It's just simply not an experience. I know you don't like that. It's not a mind field you're walking into. It's that what's being suggested is just radically different than what's normally expected.
There's nothing that you're saying that is unexpected. It's just I'm not quite sure which words capture it. So what word would you use for the understanding, the recognition of this thing we're talking about?
Yeah. So it doesn't seem, as you pointed to it when you said your hand, you don't actually know what it is.
Yeah.
And the suggestion is that is all there is. And not as a practice or as an experience.
Well, it's the ground of any experience. It equalizes all experience.
Well,
it's not an experience. By that measure, it's not somewhere else, right?
No. Well, what we're reducing is somewhere else to just what is. There isn't anywhere else. So there is only unknowing appearing as a hand. The difficulty we're having, I think, is that I'm literally talking about the end of experience, because the end of the experiencer. And one of the most difficult things I think about this message is it sounds like I'm coming, or this message is coming from somewhere else, and that's not happening there. And really, the suggestion is that's all that's happening. And then there's an additional experiencer that's put on top of it that has the illusory experience of knowing that it could get closer to now, or what is, or further away. And the message is truly, there is no possibility to get further away from what is or closer to what is. That movement, that apparent differentiation, that apparent experience is illusory. There's only immediacy, unknowable immediacy arising as everything we're discussing. And that never actually moves. There never is anything else. And that has no beginning or end to it. There's no boundaries to it. So it would be impossible to come up with a word or a definition. When earlier I said, when that contracted energy of me, or the positional experience I am, falls away, what's revealed, but only as a reflection, as that the appearance is unconditional love. But you can't possibly contain the entire appearance and all that arises with the term unconditional love. That's just a reflection. So really, what we're trying to put into words can't possibly be put into words. What we're trying to drill down on you couldn't create any distance to it, to be able to objectify it, to get closer or further away from it. It's simply already everything.
But there are analogies I think we can draw that are useful, that capture the already true aspect of it and the coincidence of it with everything that's apparent. People are having an experience, or an apparent experience of being selves in the world. And, so we use terms like consciousness and mind and knowing and experience. And it's pretty clear that there are analogs in you just by virtue of the fact that you're having this conversation. You're obviously someone who understands English. Your ears are intact. You can hear me. And you can refer to things in your environment. So there's a kind of consensual, intersubjective reality that can be referenced.
Yeah.
You have the ordinary human operating system that everyone listening is familiar with. So what we're trying to get across is
that I don't have it.
But not precisely that, because again, if needed, someone could say, well, what do you want for lunch? And you'd be able to make that decision, right? So it's not like the public functions have disappeared. And so we know there must be some ordinary residual that answers to the, many of the concepts we're using here, sight, sound, sensations, thoughts.
Yeah.
I mean, otherwise this freedom we're talking about would be synonymous with some kind of brain damage, right? We're not celebrating brain damage. We're trying to get at the nature of reality. If only it were that easy. A hammer would be
That's right.
You could just hand out
lobotomy.
hammers. Yeah. So how would you describe the phenomenon of someone listening to you teach and getting the point? Like, surely that's happened, and you meet those people.
Yeah.
What is that like, and is there anything to be usefully said about the cusp of that moment for people?
But because it's an unhappening, and because nobody wants it, I wouldn't even call it a teaching. A teaching for me has to do with knowing, and you're not, and just to draw clear boundaries, I don't think it's just being pedantic, but it is pointing to something. And I guess the most common response when there's some sort of recognition of what we're talking about is surprise. That it just is completely unexpected. And that seems to be true universally. That it just has nothing to do with the expected need or wants of the individual and what it thinks this is about. It's a surprise. And it's disconcerting. Often when that solidity falls away, it isn't what anybody would have wanted. And when the solidity comes back, there's often, when it falls away, there's often, because it's maybe not complete, there's a panic or a fear that arises. and then it comes back, and there's then the wish for it to happen again. So it just doesn't seem to happen in the purview of what one would call a normal experience, a normal process.
Well, that's interesting. So in your experience, people can have this insight into non-solidity, and then the solidity or apparent solidity can come back, and there seems to be more seeking or more orienting toward it there. And then so say more about that. I mean, how
Well, it was the same with me. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, so it was the same with you. So you had this experience, and then you were left seeking, trying to get back to it for a time. But then when you got back to it, were there more iterations of that, or once you got back the second time, then there was no more fluctuation in it?
So for me, if you wanted to describe it as a process, and just so that you understand the paradox of describing this, which is all there is already, as a process of becoming this, which is everything already, which is the dream of the individual. It was the fog of ownership, the fog of knowing, as I talked about before, the cloud of knowing just clears up. It just clears up. There can be certain climacterics, like I expressed earlier about the falling away of the contracted energy and how that builds up. But really, that's all completely irrelevant. There is, in the end, this happening isn't relevant. This appearance isn't relevant. And what you point out is that there's a functioning that still happens, but that's never been any different, really. There's just no longer the ownership that arises for the functioning of knowing where the house is, or where all the things you described before, as though this body is called Jim and its history and the ability to talk about what I just talked about. That all arises. It just doesn't arise for a center. And just to be clear, there are no centers already.
Yeah.
So this isn't about, the message has no intention on changing the appearance, because there's obviously nothing that needs to happen. That need only arises in the experience of the individual.
Right. But there is this, I guess what I'm fishing for here is this seems to be distinct from either the actual teaching or the misunderstanding of what Punjaji was teaching, which is that the expectation there was that if you recognize this thing, non-solidity, non-duality, no center, that first recognition would be permanent, or else you haven't really recognized it, right? So it's
absolutely
all or nothing.
Absolutely, that's true. But that's true. I don't know if he and I we're talking about the same thing, but as I described the falling away of that, the I am and here is the first thing that's known. That isn't the end of the individual. The end of the individual is the end of that knowing experience, the knowing cloud that seems to be the center of the appearance. And that isn't a happening, and it's impossible to pinpoint actually when that actually happens, because it isn't something added on. It's just a clearing up of an illusory sort of fog in which everything seems to arise as long as there's someone there.
But you were just describing people who have this experience where it drops away, but then they get, anxious, or it's not complete, I think you said, and then
That's right.
And then it comes back. But there's a different kind of I guess I'm just trying to reconcile two maps of the landscape that perhaps can't be reconciled, but I think one subsumes the other in a way. I mean, so like, I don't know how familiar you are with Dzogchen or any of these other non-dual teachings.
Vaguely.
But they would certainly acknowledge that for some people, the first glimpse is the last glimpse, right? And you're basically done in a second, on a Thursday afternoon, the apparent person vanishes. But for other people, the glimpse can be had, but it's possible to still get, distracted by thought thereafter. And then the glimpse is no less of a glimpse of this, underlying ground of, to use a term that the Buddhists love of emptiness, but you then have to become more familiar with it. There's some apparent work to do to stabilize this intuition, because in fact, you will just be, you're not the lucky person who had a single glimpse that was final. You're somebody who is capable of being lost in thought again. You're being distracted by the apparent contents of consciousness. Whereas somebody like Punjaji, and many people in the non-dual tradition outside of a tradition like Dzogchen are unhappy with that picture, that they just think that that's not, in fact, phenomenologically true. To glimpse it once is to be done. And I mean, I think there are reasons to doubt that picture. I'm wondering which claim you're actually making.
Both. I think I quite understand where the misunderstanding is, because I described the falling away of the contracted energy, but that isn't the end of the experiential center. Or describing this as unconditional love is not the end of the experiential center. Those are all aspects that are revealed as the contracted energy falls away, the end of knowing. And I can imagine that if one was saying that was all there was to see, and I think there might actually be people that say that, then there's just still someone there who thinks they know what happened. And here what's being described is that all of those apparent recognitions are still a part of a process, and still a part of a story, and still a part of the experience that what isn't real. And the end of it, once seen, which it isn't, and there is no end, is the end of that story, the end of this appearance. And I think we're getting hooked up on this a little bit. The end of this appearance as actually having a context, because it doesn't. And when this appearance is no longer contextual, then whatever arises is just a part of that non-contextual appearance. So when there's no longer a context, there is no longer an ability for a context to arise, because everything arising is simply non-contextual. So that even if you could imagine, which I don't know, that the me or whatever, the contracted energy would arise again, that would still be just non-contextual happening, chaos happening, appearing as whatever this is appearing as. And I don't seem to be able to get it across, but that is already the case. Everything else that seems to happen within that is just part of the dream of the individual, which is constantly within a process. This isn't a process. This is already non-contextual.
Yeah. Well, so here are a few things I believe. I believe I understand you. I believe we're speaking about the same thing. And again, the terminology here could trip us up, but I believe that this thing you're pointing to is something fundamental about the nature of all experience, consciousness and its contents in every moment, that's not constructed, that doesn't get improved, that doesn't get produced by one's effort. It is the non-context of everything that is appearing. I believe I recognize that and can recognize that whenever I pay attention. Again, now using a term that has dualistic overtones that are not intended here, but to recognize the centerlessness of the moment. That is obvious to me, and is obvious whenever I remember to notice it, right? But I do find that I'm capable of overlooking it.
Yeah.
The apparent individual, I'm capable of being asleep and dreaming again, in some sense, if only for moments at a time. And that dream is being continually punctuated by this recognition of no inside and no outside, or no center. On one account, I either don't get it. On another account, I get it imperfectly, and I'm still working out this non-path by this non-dual logic. Within a Dzogchen context, my experience is perfectly understandable.
Yeah.
I'm having the expected experience in a Dzogchen context. In your context, I think I can be heard to not get what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But the truth is, I don't see any basis for that claim in my experience.
No, you wouldn't.
Okay, so then help perform surgery on my
I can't.
ignorance
All
here.
I can say is you say you recognize the non-center, the non-inside and outside. I've never recognized that. I've never recognized what's being shared here. It has no solidity, fixedness, knowing in it.
Okay, but so I agree. I think we're just using the term recognition differently, or it's got some
Okay.
onus on it in your brain that it doesn't have in mine. But I think if we want to describe what emptiness is like, I expect we're going to agree. Write down. We'll check all the boxes.
I couldn't describe emptiness.
Well,
Just like I couldn't describe what is.
But you just started by saying it's the non-solidity, the non. Just you described it in terms of what it's not, which is obviously quite a traditional way of doing it. The fact that it's not produced, it's not compounded, it's not many things, it's not one thing, right? It's not unity, but it's not.
Well, I think the
not
reason
unity.
it's spoken about in negative terms is because it can't be conceived. It can't be. That's where the landmines are. Is it seems like there's a response when it seems like this which can't be spoken of is put into a context of understanding or knowing or consciousness or recognition. That seems obviously part of the experience of knowing.
All right, so I mean, we're getting wrapped around the axle here a little bit, but I think it's useful because here's what I'm imagining. I'm imagining that our listeners are more confused than they need to be by our apparent non-alignment here, or not actually being able to totally converge on how to talk about this. I'm going to tell you two stories here that get at parts of the problem that I'm trying to get across, and it'd be interesting to get your reaction to them. So the problem I've had with this style of kind of radical non-duality and an apparent unwillingness to make certain traditional distinctions, certain pathy sounding distinctions, is the following. And this came out of my experience with Punjaji. So as I said, there are many people who are studying with Punjaji who would have some epiphany with him, they'd have some breakthrough, and he would celebrate them as essentially the Buddha of the day, right?
Yeah.
So like somebody, I was there once with a few Buddhist teachers who we had brought to see Punjaji. We were spending 10 days with Punjaji, and then we were going to get Dzogchen teachings from Tulku Urgyen in Nepal, who we hadn't yet met, and so it's kind of a spiritual tour. And so we went to Punjaji first, and somewhere near the end of our stay there, this woman had some kind of breakthrough, and she was really a wonderful person. She, just a very happy person, a good advertisement for the benefits of full enlightenment. And Punjaji was celebrating her as essentially done. She had finished the whole program, right? She had this breakthrough, and she was talking the talk of there's nothing but consciousness, or there's nothing but emptiness, so on Punjaji's account, there was no more to do. There was no more distinctions to make. Any talk about meditation or effort or paths at this point would have been blasphemy, essentially. And then we were leaving to go to see Tulku Urgyen, and this woman asked if she could come with us. She just wanted to kind of probably test her enlightenment against some other system. And so she, as she was a very nice woman, we thought, yeah, great, she's good company. So we went to Nepal, and so we were in the room with her and a few other people getting Tulku Urgyen's non-dual teachings. And once that process started, at some point, he asked for questions, and she launched into her Punjaji-approved account of her own enlightenment. And this was a fascinating moment because, I had to get through translation, which was amusing. But once it became clear what she was claiming about herself, she was claiming there was no individual. She was claiming, many of the much of the language you have used and I have used in this conversation, she was expressing. And at one point, Tugorian said, "Well, how often are thoughts arising for you? I mean, how often are you thinking, and what's that like?" And she said, "Oh, no, I haven't had a thought in a week."
Hmm.
And he said, "Well, wait a minute." It was comical to see how this was struggling to get through translation. But at a certain point, he said, "Okay, we're all just going to wait for you to have your next thought. I can't proceed with what I was planning for today's seminar until we drill down on this. So we're all patient people. We're just going to wait for you to have a thought."
Hmm.
And over the course of 30 seconds, we watched her enlightenment completely unravel. What became clear is that she was a very happy, kind of ecstatic person who was, had a lot of concentration or some concentration, and she was having a great experience, right? She was very blissful.
Hmm.
And she was probably just thinking incessantly about how empty everything was and how beautiful and how non-dual. And like she was just not mindful enough to know that she was lost in very happy thoughts basically every
Hmm.
moment of the day, right? So that's what I see as a liability here, that if you're not going to avail yourself of any pathy language, that will allow you to differentiate the difference between being lost in thought or not,
Hmm.
you can't necessarily catch the people who come away thinking that they're Buddhas or that there's nothing left to do or that any
Hmm.
use of attention is just as much a symptom of ignorance as any other use of attention.
Hmm.
Whereas I don't know what went on to happen to her, but my perception of that moment was that, Took Oregon had performed a kind of necessary spiritual intervention, essentially, and got her
Hmm.
back, made her available again to recognizing what her experience actually was. And, she could look more deeply into things, whether you call that practice or not. Anyway, that was the first story that was in my brain to bounce off of you. I worry
Yeah.
that if the path is infinitely steep, people bounce off of it in ways that are, unfortunate.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think, I think it's what's being shared here is truly unwantable in that sense. Whereas, as you said, as you described with Punjaji, that was something that had some kudos to it of no thinking or bliss. That's just not, there's this. And this, what's being shared isn't a teaching. I think a lot of our misunderstanding isn't pedantic. It's different. Well, it's a perspective running into no perspective, because this isn't a teaching, and it isn't actually concerned in that sense of the people that come. It's not expected for anybody to get anything. It's not intentional, the message. It merely points out, and I think what's already in a way known and undeniable, and that is what seems to be happening. This is everything. And that can be misunderstood. I mean, people walk away and go, well, Jim says there's nothing to do. And that's just simply not what's being suggested. The suggestion is there isn't anyone that ever does anything, and that sense of need to find something missing is illusory. I totally believe people misunderstand it. I'm certain that that's a lot of what happens at the meetings, is that it's misunderstood. It's very difficult because you can't reference it at any point because it's not within anyone's experience. And you can't relate to it because it doesn't meet the needs of the individual for something to happen. One of the core experiences of the individual is that something needs to happen. That's still part of the illusion. And that will take what's being suggested and try to put it into practice. I call it applied non-duality. It just doesn't make any sense. Non-duality isn't something separate as a concept to be attained or found. It's pointed out as from this perspective, it's pointed out as non-duality because there isn't any separation already. Any effort to attain is merely the obscuring The fact that it isn't separate, there isn't a separation to overcome.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I think that's a useful concept that may differentiate or may clarify the ways in which we're talking past each other here or at cross purposes. So applied non-duality. In my view, there certainly seems to be a stage of this process where applied non-duality isn't as crazy or as counterproductive as you seem to suggest, right? There's something to recognize again for many people. And it's not that the first recognition wasn't of the real non-duality. It's just that it wasn't final. Within the dream, the experience of waking up from this dream can have apparent stages for people, even though once you have finally woken up, it may not make any sense to talk about stages, or the stages were illusory, right? So,
but they don't have anything to do with anyone.
yes.
The experience or the idea that there's a process or that they have something to do or that there's a benefit is still a part of the illusory experience, that this has some intention to it, the appearance. And that implies that there's a better way for this to be and a worse way for this to be.
But then what do you mean when you use a term like unconditional love, right? I mean, that's some ancillary benefit of this or some aspect of this that is, I'm not surprised at all by that term, but I would have been surprised if you had said unconditional anger or unconditional shame, right?
Same thing. As far as I'm concerned, those are all really the same thing. Unconditional love is merely a response to the conditional experience of the individual, that love is conditional. And when that falls away, it's obvious that there isn't any condition to love. But I think it would be a fallacy to say that that what we're talking about is unconditional love, because really what we're talking about is what can't be spoken about. There's actually no way to find an edge or an other in order to objectify or define the whole of the appearance. And here comes another one that's not true, but it's just another reflection of that falling away of the conditional freedom of the individual. It's too unconditionally free to be defined or contained. And what's recognized is that the whole process is that unconditional freedom having the experience that something needs to happen. It is that unconditional love having the experience that it's conditional. So there's just simply no separation to overcome. That only arises in the illusory experience of the individual. And the illusory, but truly illusory experience of the individual. There's no individual.
Yeah, no, so the second story I was going to bounce off of you, which is one I just stumbled upon. I think it's about 10 years old, but I stumbled upon it relatively recently. There was a tourist bus somewhere in Scandinavia, I think Norway, Sweden, somewhere, and they pulled into a rest stop, and there were about 30 people on the bus, and the tourists got off to use the bathroom and get something to eat, and one of the tourists was I believe an Asian woman who got off and she changed her clothes before getting back on the bus. And when everyone was back on the bus, some people noticed that there was an Asian woman who hadn't yet gotten back on the bus, who they were concerned not to leave behind. And so they went looking for her and couldn't find her. And then a search party was formed, and they called the police, and they rented a helicopter that was going to take off at dawn to look for this missing tourist. And at some point during these machinations, I mean, many hours into it, the woman realized that she was the missing tourist, right?
Yeah.
And so this struck me as a beautiful analogy for the process we're talking about. It's not true to say that when you focus on what that moment of epiphany was like, when the tourist who was never lost, discovers that she is part of the search party that is part of the problem looking for her. It's not true to say that the search was ever consummated.
Hmm.
The lost tourist was never found because the tourist was never lost, right? And there's something in that unraveling that is instructive here, that you're not, when you recognize the way, again, to use my terms here, the way consciousness already is, the fact that it already doesn't have a self in the middle of it, and it doesn't get improved by what it knows. There's nothing you need to do to it to make it empty or expansive or non-dual. Then that recognition has this quality of the very premise by which you sought to recognize it, that effort, it's not fulfilled, it's just the basis from which you made it has been undercut. But again, it's my experience, and I'm certainly not alone in this, that there's this stage, or apparent stage in this process where you're still having to notice this. Again, I don't know which verb is sanctioned here, but you're still having to become more familiar with this. Otherwise, there's this apparent experience of being able to overlook it, for the purpose of getting angry or getting distracted by things in the world, or, getting awareness trimmed down by something that happens to which you're reacting, to which once again, you are the ape who is reacting to the world. And then the process is one of cutting through that again and noticing this intrinsic mystery to experience, to consciousness.
Yeah.
And yet what I'm hearing from you is your concern that really isn't the recognition. I realize recognition is not your favorite term, but that isn't the insight, that there's something more or less to be discovered here that emphatically ends this pseudo search. There are no stages to it.
Yeah, absolutely. That there isn't actually a mystery that needs to be solved. The experience that there needs to be an answer just comes out of the illusory experience of separation. That this mystery is never actually solved. The lost individual, the lost tourist, is never found.
But I agree with that, right? It captures to me how things seem when I'm paying attention. Right?
Let's drill down. Can I ask a couple of things and just drill down on a couple of points, such as consciousness? Because it's just obvious here that that is part of the illusory experience of the individual. Consciousness is an experience in separation. And in that experience, one can be more or less conscious. And that changes the perspective or the experience of the individual.
Yeah, so I'm not using consciousness in that sense. I mean, I would use it as synonymous with this apparent happening, right? The fact that anything is appearing, the fact that anything seems to be any way at all, is the fact of consciousness.
Yeah, but you're talking about being able to be more or less conscious, and that having to do with being more or less aware.
No,
more or less. You use certain words. I can't remember your words exactly.
Well, no. Conventionally speaking, there are degrees of consciousness, with respect to, wakefulness, general anesthesia. I remain agnostic as to what it's actually like to be in some of those states that we can't remember, whether it's a failure of memory or an actual interruption of consciousness. That's very difficult to distinguish. But in terms of degrees of awareness of this thing we're talking about, I mean, I would agree with you. It's paradoxical. It makes no sense to overlook it.
It's not possible.
Well, it's apparently possible because there's this
only in the illusory. But the overlooking is an illusion. It never actually happens.
Yes.
So the idea that you could make it unhappen, it's just part of the illusion, part of the experience that it is happening. It never happens. It's not happening now.
That's true. That's true. But to use your language you used before, this wisp of a cloud that can just go away, right? Like the sense of self the sense of there being an individual in the middle of experience, that can evaporate, right?
Yeah.
But
And the evaporation is recognized as never having happened. So it's not something that's added on. It's not, I now have a new experience. It's actually the evaporation of experience. And what's left is the recognition that there never was experience, but that's not a recognition of what this is.
Okay, so but then what would you say to someone who believes that this evaporation experience can happen many times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times?
I don't agree with that. I think there can be many different sort of revelations, uncoverings of what's being hidden by the illusory experience of the individual. But the end of the cloud of ownership is the end of experience, the end, as we said, context. And then there's thereafter, of which there isn't a context which anything could arise and create a context. There is just simply, but it's already the case. I mean, it's so obvious that what's happening isn't connected to anything else. It's whole in and of itself.
Hmm.
It has no need to have a history. It has no need to have a future. It is in and of itself whole, and in that way singular, unconnected to anything else. And so you can't even really wrap your arms around it conceptually, because it's just simply without limit. And anything that arises is that. Just because there's a thought of the past is not evidence of a past. It merely is this non-contextual appearance appearing as a past. So there would be no way for anything to happen to create a need of context. Now, the brain still functions. This can still find home in the grocery store and all of that. But that doesn't happen within a context for anyone. It's just simply what is arising as whatever function seems to be happening. And there's nobody conscious of that. And you couldn't get closer or further away from it. That whole experience is just part of the illusory dream. And everything that happens in it as far as a process is merely a process, an illusory process inside this, which is already non-contextual.
Yeah, no, I believe I'm unconfused by everything you say about this non-contextual reality. The place where I'm stuck is that it just seems descriptively true of many, many people that there can be an apparently gradual process by which that gets finally recognized. And I guess
that seems to be.
Yeah. And I guess I have some question of whether one can have a false understanding of the end point. So, I mean, what would it mean for you to be confused about there being further insights to have, right? I mean, I get that you probably don't see any basis for such a claim. Like, where would you point for more to be understood about this
totally
centerless condition of everything appearing? Is there anything in your experience psychologically, perhaps the way to ask this question is just to compare what you're saying to a more traditional teaching, which it sounds like you would either not agree with or find uninteresting. In traditional schools of Buddhism, like, the Theravada, where mindfulness is mostly coming from, there's a different expectation of how the path unfolds. And it's one in which it's very clearly advertised that as you make progress in insight, you will uproot, and this is using their jargon, you will uproot certain negative emotions such that they never arise again. So something like anger or ill will, right? There's a stage in practice where anger simply cannot arise. So if anger does arise for you, that is a symptom of the fact that you are not yet fully at the end of the path, right?
Yeah.
So it seems to be your claim that there's nothing that can no longer arise, right? Any possible thought or emotion is still possible.
Seems so.
It
Yeah.
just is viewed from a very different place. So I guess the question is, what if you're mistaken about that?
Yeah.
What if there's actually a way to take this further such that it would be impossible for anger to ever arise again?
Yeah.
How is it possible, given what you've said, how is it possible for anger to arise?
Bad car drivers seem to be a good starting point for anger to arise, or at least mild frustration.
But what are you doing with your mind in that moment such that you would experience anger rather than either compassion or nothing? I mean, bad
Yeah.
car drivers aren't, I mean, cars and their bad drivers aren't really real in any ultimate sense.
Well, nothing is really real, but the only thing completely unreal is the experience of being an individual.
Mm.
I do get where you're coming from. And, in the story of Jim, there were those states like the lady had of no thinking and of, this constant state of awareness or consciousness of the awareness before the I am. And in that state, which I think a lot of these teachings are pointing to, there is a total unaffectedness by emotions which arise. So there would be no need to act them out or for them to be, expressed in any way. And I don't know, I guess if you stayed in that state for some time, which maybe people do, then maybe they wouldn't arise anymore. I don't know. But what's being shared here is almost the absolute opposite to that. It's no longer a position or a state that is behind everything, that's no longer affected by the appearance. It is literally that there is no separation between what appears, because the experiencer, whether it be before experience, before existence, is just no longer, and that has just simply fallen away. It's much more simple than the detached pre-brain, pre-existence awareness. What we're talking about, what this is sharing, that there's simply what arises, and it has, like you said, could it go further? That would still be what's appearing. So going further seems to suggest, could there be a better place, a more developed, a more aware, a more, and that would still be what's arising, what's happening. It would still be void of value. It would still be void of need. It would still be void of intention, because it would still be just simply what's arising.
Right. So I believe I see where you're going there. I guess I'm still stuck driving the car among bad drivers here and wondering what could produce anger. So in my experience, so again,
but
just to
but
map
that's
this,
coming from a position that anger shouldn't arise, that there's that the appearance has a real intention to it, and that there are things that are better than other things.
well, no,
And that
even just bracketing that, from my experience, it's not clear to me how anger can arise if without its proximate cause being my overlooking this thing we're talking about, if only for a moment.
But I don't think we're actually talking about the same thing.
I'm agnostic as to whether we are. I don't see how we couldn't be, but
Okay.
so I think we probably are, and we're just, we're still grinding the gears on the meanings of certain words like consciousness. But the thing we may be disagreeing about is the fine-grained mechanics of this, in that I believe it's possible to really recognize this thing you're talking about, but have that not be the final recognition. I think it is intelligible to say that someone got Jim Newman's point fully on a Tuesday at 4 o'clock, but then by 4:15 had overlooked it again and had to be pointed back to it, and then got to a place in her practice where she could recognize it whenever she wanted, but she wanted other things, for whatever reason and spent the next few years only recognizing it sometimes and going back to sleep for most of the time. Right? I believe that's an intelligible life course, and it sounds like you don't. But a related issue here is, now we're back in the car driving. It seems to me that to become angry based on the behavior of some other driver isn't the case of even someone who recognizes the non-duality of experience. Can only happen if that non-duality is overlooked for some period so as to give rise to this, all of the kind of concrete assumptions that would be required to produce anger in that case.
What do you mean by non-duality? This which it can or cannot be recognized, which can be seen and then no longer attended to.
Well, that there's no subject, to use your word, individual, but for me, subject captures it a little bit more because I'm not talking about the body. There's no subject in the middle of awareness. There's no thinker in addition to thoughts. Thoughts simply arise in consciousness, again, to use my word.
Yeah.
But there's no thinker. I guess so. One analogy that works for me is that many people, when they begin meditating or looking into these things, they sense that it's like they're on the riverbank watching the stream of consciousness go by, right? And if you're doing a practice like mindfulness, you can become mindful of the stream. You can notice the boats and the ducks and the water itself, and you can clearly be aware of what's going by, or you could be distracted, but then you come back and then you're clearly aware again. But there is this sense that there's a point of view, a place to stand on the riverbank where you are the one who is being mindful. You are being the witness. You are the meditator. And that starting point is an illusion. There is no riverbank. There's only the river. You are identical to the thing that you think you're paying attention to. There's no place from which to pay attention to experience itself or consciousness itself. And so when that collapses, when there's no center anymore, when experience is no longer being appropriated from some apparent point of view within experience, right? The I, the me, the subject in the head, when there's just this totality. And I think, I'm certainly partial to the emptiness style language more than I am to the unity style language, because unity kind of grasps at it or reifies it in a way that is not, I think is also misleading.
Yeah.
It's not one and it's not many. It's just what is, and it's just consciousness and its apparent changes is the way I would tend to describe it. I'm saying that can be vividly experienced, but then it can be overlooked or seem to be overlooked. Again, once you experience it again in the next moment, it is a genuine mystery how it could ever be overlooked. That makes no sense, and yet there is this experience of continually reawakening to this thing. But when I'm thinking about, an emotion like anger, a classically negative emotion that spiritual people most of the time think spirituality is designed to overcome, the reason why that expectation makes some sense to me is that it seems to me that anger only arises based on a prior moment of overlooking this non-duality. It arises based on the kind of contraction of energy that you described as going away when you break through to this. Anger doesn't presuppose some contraction in your experience?
Not at all. No emotions presuppose contraction. The contraction is simply the ownership of those emotions and thoughts. And that ownership, the knowing of owning or the knowing of the thoughts and feelings, are what then create this tale of need, meaning, and purpose, value, and intention.
So then how is anger at that point?
Well, it's just simply what is, of course. But in the conversation, it makes sense to call it anger. It's really just a sensation in the body that just moves through, isn't it?
Yeah, I only experience it from the other side, however, which is I notice I'm angry, and then I recognize it as just, as you say, just this pattern of energy. But for
But
me,
that's a context, and nothing actually has that context. And it's from that context, as far as from, let's call it a perspective, that it's seen as somehow inappropriate.
leave the judgment aside. My experience is that if I'm recognizing no context, if I'm having what I'm calling a recognition of non-duality in the midst of anger, right? Two things seem to be the case for me. One is I wasn't having that recognition as the proximate cause of the anger arising in the first place. I don't have the experience of clearly recognizing this thing we're talking about and then having anger arise, right?
Yeah. I've never had the experience of recognizing what we're talking about.
Okay. Well,
and I really think there's a fundamental difference
in what we're talking about based on my harping on that
absolutely.
term?
Well, it's not the term. I think you're describing what actually happens for you. I think you're describing what you actually do. I think you're describing, as you said, being mindful, and that mindfulness dissolving boundaries, and that being, and as you call it, an experience of oneness. And
not of oneness, but I would say
of not
emptiness,
two-ness, or unit, yeah. And that is just fundamentally different than what we're describing here. I mean, I meditated. I had those experiences, and what I'm talking about isn't in any way logical or approachable. It is a dissolution of something that never really happened, which is that this has a context to it, a real context, and that can't be approached, and there's no way to overlook it. I just think we're fundamentally talking about different things.
Okay, but again, I hold out hope that we're actually not. But
okay,
granting all of those things, how is there a way to get angry again?
Well, why wouldn't there be? As you said, the girl who was, I can't remember the context, but anyway, was aware and thoughts were arising, just nobody owns them. Why wouldn't anger or any other emotion arise? Why would there be one emotion rather than another? Where's the limit? What's the...
Well, because anger has a kind of structure that is falsified by this structureless insight, right? I mean, not all emotions have the same logic. So shame has its own logic, embarrassment has its own logic.
Yeah.
Some emotions are intrinsically social, right? Some emotions seem to be only born of having triangulated on yourself and looked at yourself through the eyes of others, like shame.
But you're telling me what you've understood through investigation.
Well, yeah, I'm just saying, if you introduce me to a new Buddha who claims to be a Buddha, but they claim to feel shame all day long, I've got some questions to ask. Right. Right? Based on what I believe I know about shame and the claim of Buddhahood.
Yeah. I don't know that shame still arises, but anger can arise. It doesn't. I can't think of anything that wouldn't arise.
Well, except shame. Why not?
Well, there isn't anyone responsible for what's arising anymore. Shame seems to be somehow connected to the experience that you should have done something differently or could have been better.
And it's also based on an awareness or a seeming awareness, an expectation of how others are perceiving you, right? Like when you're aware that you have become an object of disgust for others, that you're sort of viewing yourself through their eyes. It would be impossible, for instance, to feel, or one would imagine it would be impossible to feel shame in front of dogs or, other non-human animals. But you bring people into the audience, something changes. And it's this implicit sense of what their minds are doing.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, I realize in this timeless expanse, I've kept you for 2 long hours. So I find this fascinating. I I think it's anyway. I think that there may be an opportunity at some point down the line for you to perform further psychic surgery on me, and we can see if we exactly what I don't realize or what we are just using different terms for. This is a very useful exercise, I think, for me and anyone hearing us. So thank you for your time, and I hope to do it again.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure, really.
And Jim, before we sign off, if people want more information about you, where should they go online to look up your seminars and all the rest?
Simply this.
Is
.com, I think.
Is there a hyphen between simply and this?
There is, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, great. Well,